to the church. And in this case, it's speaking about love, our trust, our church that trusts one another. And it comes from verse number 7 in regard to love believes all things. Believes all things. And so, but at the outset, of course, there's a little kind of a parable of sorts that's told with respect to a king who sends his 4 sons at different times of the year to inspect a certain type of plant. And then, of course, obviously each one brings back a different report of that plant because it's in a different season. It is, it either appears to be dead because it's winter, or it's sprouting, or it's got fruit on it. There's any number of stages that a plant goes through in any particular year. And then, of course, he says to each one has brought back an accurate report, but it's incomplete. Because it hasn't been observed by each one in each season. And so the lesson there for us is, as Christians, we have to be careful about judgments that we make in regard to how we see other people. And I was thinking in particular, in this day and time, now this book came out well before Facebook and social media and whatnot. This book's been out for probably at least 20 years or more, all right? But I think there's a lesson for us with regard to our observation of people being incomplete or based on false premises. Just by way of example, you can look at certain people's Facebook page and you would think that there is nothing ever wrong going on in their life. It's always peaches and cream. It's rainbows and unicorns and just all the things that you might think of that are nice. And yet sometimes we know those individuals, right? And we know that the picture that is being presented to the world is not an accurate picture. But for the most part, most people don't know that. I mean, I'll just give you an example, in kind of an extreme example. All right, think about, and I think most of us would know. Think about Robin Williams. I mean, man, Robin Williams was. I mean, you think Robin Williams was at the top of his game. He'd had successful TV shows. He was a successful stand-up. He traveled the world. He was one of the favorites of our armed forces. He would go and perform for armed forces. I mean, he was a guy that you would think, man, that guy, and not to mention he was really wealthy. And you think, man, that's a guy that's got to be on. That guy's got to be on top of the world. And then, what happens? Kills himself. In other words, this, and by the way, I'm not saying that he always presented himself in that way, but sometimes we get an incomplete picture of how things really are, and this can go for people that we interact with every day or on a regular basis. We can think, for example, we might think that a couple is, that they're madly in love with one another and everything is just always hunky-dory, and yet you don't know what goes on behind closed doors. We find those things out through the course of time, that it's not maybe what it was presented to be or what we incorrectly perceived it to be.
I see that every day at school.
Sure, I mean, yeah, you can see it with kids, and there's just so many scenarios wherein we can get. If we don't know a situation, we can get a false idea about people or situations. And so with that in mind, going forward, the concept here is love believes all things. That means that we are to assume the best. We are to assume the best. See, and that's another part or problem with social media, is because social media cannot accurately convey tone or intent. Somebody might make a statement on social media and two people take it completely completely the opposite. and they don't understand. You can't. There are no facial expressions in social media. There's no voice inflection. There's none of the nonverbal cues, and so things can be misinterpreted. So a good rule of thumb is when we see things, especially for example in that environment, assume the best and don't assume the worst. And so when people post or people make comments, assume the best. That's just a good practice, because I'd rather assume the best and be wrong as assume the worst and be wrong. Isn't that right? I mean, assuming the best and being wrong creates far fewer problems than assuming the worst and being wrong. So we always want to assume the best as we think about these things. And so with regard to a congregation, and about the beginning of the second line, love moves us to believe in and trust one another until verified evidence forces us to think otherwise. It's not that we're looking for reasons not to trust people, but sometimes those reasons manifest themselves in ways that it becomes undeniable what the truth, what the reality is, as opposed to what is believed. In love, we give one another the benefit of the doubt. We place the best connotation possible on actions and words. With love, we are gracious, not suspicious. We are careful, but not critical or judgmental. John 7:24 says, "Do not judge according to appearance, but judge righteous judgment." Now, sometimes we miss the nuance of some of these words in our New Testament. For example, the word appearance. For example, in 1 Thessalonians 5, it says, "Avoid every appearance of evil." And some have taken that to mean that if anybody could possibly misconstrue this in a bad way, you need to avoid it. But that's not what the verse says. The word appearance means you can see it. That's what the word appearance means. And so when Jesus says, do not judge according to appearance, what he means is superficially, but judge righteous judgment. All right, and so sometimes we miss the nuance of some of the words as they appear in our New Testament. Of course, for Matthew 7:1-5 is the famous "judge not" text, although that particular context is dealing with the Pharisees and their judgmental attitude toward everybody but themselves. They held others to a standard that they themselves were not willing to be held to. Jesus condemned them. He says they put heavy burdens on people, and they won't even so much as lift with anything with their little finger. That's obviously is hyperbole, but Jesus is talking about the hypocrisy and the overbearing judgmentalism of the Pharisees. A passage that's not mentioned, and this is one I think is important for us, is in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and in verse number 5, or excuse me, not verse 5, verse 4, where Paul is speaking about those who do not consent to wholesome words and the doctrine which accords with godliness. It says that those who do not do such things, or those that are not consistent in these areas, are proud, they know nothing, they're obsessed with disputes, arguments over words, from which, in other words, disputes and arguments over words. And out of these things come envy, strife, reviling, and the King James says evil surmisings. The New King James says evil suspicions. In other words, unwarranted suspicions that are negative. In other words, unwarranted negative suspicions. In other words, we're thinking the worst about a person or a situation without having a proper understanding of the background of that thing. So I wrote down 1 Timothy 6 and verse 4 in connection with love believes all things. Then, for example, in Luke, he calls this Luke's account of the Sermon on the Mount. That's really not correct. There are two different sermons. Right? There are some texts in our Bibles that are different accounts of the same event. This is not one of those. The Sermon on the Mount was preached on a mountain. It's Matthew 5, beginning verse 1. The sermon in Luke 6, it says that Jesus found a flat place, which is obviously not a mountain. And so it's more accurately referred to as the Sermon on the Plain. But they both did contain many of the same principles, many of the same things. For example, some of the Beatitudes are found in both of them. The admonition to love your enemies is found in both of them. The parallel of Matthew 7:21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, is paralleled in Luke 6:46. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and do not do the things that I say? And so there are a lot of comparable statements in the two, but they are not the same sermon. All right? But in this particular sermon, in Luke's account of the parable or of the sermon on the plains, there are a number of what he calls imperative verbs. There are verbs that are not up to our discretion. An imperative is a must. It's a must. And here are some of the imperatives: love, be merciful, judge not, condemn not. And so the note here is, a heart that is full of love has no room for harsh, unfounded judgments. And then he talks about Barnabas. Barnabas is a great example of this. When Saul came to Jerusalem from Damascus, he was a Christian. He was a new Christian. But when he tried to slip into the worship assembly, they weren't having it. And for good reason, right? I mean, this guy had done what? He dragged the people out of their houses. He put them in jail. He tortured them. He gave his vote to put them to death. All these things. But Barnabas knew. And Barnabas takes Saul and presents him to the elders and starts telling them all the things that have happened in Saul's life. This is not the same man. This is not the same man that you knew of before. He's changed. He's one of us. By the way, when Saul had been blinded on the road to Damascus, and he went into the city and dwelled in the city and was waiting on Ananias, and God appeared to Ananias and said, "Hey, I want you to go to this house, and I want you to find this feller named Saul. And here's what I want you to do." Ananias was in no hurry to get there. He said, "Lord," it's almost like, the funny thing is, "Lord, don't you know who that guy is? Haven't you heard what he's done? Haven't you heard the whole purpose of him being here?" It's like Lord, where have you been? And God says, "Go." God said, "Go and do this." And then Ananias gives all of his excuses, and God repeats, he says, "Go." Go. For he is a chosen vessel of mine. But Ananias didn't want to go, and for good reason. But the point is, when God said go, it was time to go. When God said go, it was time to go. And good for Ananias that he did what God told him to do after a brief exchange with the Lord. But Ananias's fear or surmising about Saul was not evil. It was not undue. It was not unjust. Everybody knew what Saul was. Everybody knew what Saul did. He just didn't know. There were some things he didn't know, right? That's what we talked about. He didn't have all the facts. He didn't know about the Lord talking to Saul, and that the Lord knew that Saul was a penitent soul. And so, he didn't have all the facts. But Barnabas did, and we see the reaction of those two men is different. And so, a church that trusts, we want to trust one another and believe the best in one another. All right, let's go to the next page, page 22, looking at the church that encourages one another. The church that encourages one another. How important is encouragement? How important is it to a sixth grader?
I was going to say it depends on where that person's mindset is. Some people need more encouragement than others. Some people need encouragement more in different times of their life. You know what I'm saying? So, yes, it's important, but the level of encouragement
Yeah. But the right encouragement at the right time can be a life changer, right?
Yes.
It can be a life changer. Now, the account here is given of a guy that was running across China. Now, I don't know why anybody would want to do that. But 2,000 miles. Said for 53 consecutive days he ran. And said he continued to run because someone offered him a word of encouragement. What was that word of encouragement? Well, about the time he got ready to quit, word was brought to him that there was a village ahead that was all a flitter about his arrival. They couldn't wait. They're like, he's going to, this guy's a legend. He's been running he's running all across our country. By the way, that's a whole lot more important to other people in other parts of the world than it is America. We don't care. Like, for example, if I started over around Piedmont on the Georgia state line and I started running, and word came to the city of Hamilton that there's a guy running across the state of Alabama and he's coming through Hamilton, you know what you're going to get? Shrug of the shoulders. Right? Shrug of the shoulders. Nobody cares. But I promise you, if I went to Ghana and I started in the eastern region and I started running west, and I promise you, word would get out that I was running across Ghana, and I'd be a rock star in every village, that I ran through. Primarily because I'm white, all right. But they love that kind of thing because it's an honor. It's an honorable thing. And so this guy's running across China, and about the time he gets ready to quit, he hears that there are people waiting on you to run through their village. And so he pushes on. Just a simple word of encouragement allowed him to press on. I'll give you another example. This one's closer to home. A friend of mine, Bob Beard, runs in our little running club, and Bob set out. He was going to run 100 miles. And so he went down to Alabaster. There's a race down there in October called the Endless Mile, and it's a 1 mile track through a park. And so he signed up. I think he signed up to do it in 48 hours so he could rest at some point. And I think he got to about mile 70, mile 75, and man, he just about had it. He had literally rubbed a spot on his toe that was so big they were determined whether or not they were going to sew it back on or cut it off. But there were some people from our running club that went down there that evening when he was getting close and encouraged him. And you know what he did? He finished his 100 miles. He finished his 100 miles. Just because two people drove from Marion County to Alabaster to encourage him to finish his 100-miler. I was just thinking the same thing. Philip will tell you. The first year that we ran in St. Jude, we ran the marathon, which is not 100 miles, but it is 26 plus. And we got to about mile 19, and there's Kevin and Treasure Scott, our friends from Freed Harbor that have visited here a number of times, standing there at mile 19 waiting on us. And they had, of course they lived in Memphis, but they had driven and waited on us, to get there, so that they could cheer us on. That's encouraging.
That's not what I was talking about.
What were you talking about?
I'm talking about when you run through the hospital.
Oh man.
And you see.
Yeah.
They bring the patients out and you run through the St. Jude.
Yeah, I can't hardly talk about that. That's tough.
They're holding little signs that say things like,
"Run like my life depends on it."
Or run for me because I can't, or
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah,
so many things that will just.
That's the best and worst mile in that race. It's the best and worst.
But it will encourage you.
Oh man,
You
yeah.
should feel ashamed.
Johnny.
No, I don't remember. I don't remember when it was. It was right after we had started coming here after I'd obeyed the gospel. It was probably a couple of months into it. And like I said, whatever it was, it didn't matter because it's over now. But I was having probably the worst time. I was struggling with something. Like I said, I couldn't tell you what it was. but I was having a really bad week. I got a phone call. Martha called me just to see how I was doing. Talked to me for 20 minutes. Like I said, now I couldn't even tell you what it was about.
But it was big then.
But it was enough that I remember Martha called me.
Yep. The right word at the right time. I mean, can make all the
She didn't want
difference.
anything. She just wanted to see how I was doing.
Make all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
I was looking. This is not in your. I don't think it's in the book. At least I didn't find it anywhere. Look at 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. We're going to begin in verse number 1. I want you to listen. I want you to listen to what Paul says. Okay? I want you to listen to what he says and why he says it and what the result is. All right? We are going to read the first 7 verses. 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, the first 7 verses. Therefore, when we could no longer endure it, we thought it good to be left in Athens alone, and sent Timothy, our brother and minister of God, and our fellow laborer in the gospel of Christ, to establish you and encourage you concerning your faith, that no one should be shaken by these afflictions. Now, by the way, earlier in chapter 2, he's talking about that Satan has been actively working against him. There are some things, he says, there are some things we've been wanting to do. He said, and Satan hindered us. He hindered us. And so Paul says, during this period of extreme difficulty, we decided to stop for a while and send Timothy on. And it says of him, he was sent to establish you and encourage you in your faith, that no one should be shaken by these afflictions. For you yourselves know that we are appointed to this. The church at Thessalonica had been persecuted. Go back to the end of chapter 1. And through the early part of chapter 2, Paul's talking to them about the afflictions that they suffered because they were Christians. He says, but you know, in other words, Paul says, look, we didn't hide this from you when you became Christians. You know that this was part of the package. This was part of what you bought into, was the possibility, the very real possibility of real persecution. All right? He says, for in fact, we told you before when we were with you that we would suffer tribulation, just as it has happened, and you know. For this reason, when I could no longer endure it, I sent to know your faith, lest by some means the tempter had tempted you, and our labor might have been in vain. But now that Timothy has come to us from you, and brought us good news of your faith and love, and that you always have good remembrance of us, greatly desiring to see us, as we also to see you. Therefore, brethren, in all our afflictions and distress, we were comforted concerning you by your faith. So Paul says, man, it was bad. It was bad. We literally could not go on. But we sent Timothy because we were concerned not about ourselves, we were concerned about you, that your faith might be shaken. And now Timothy's come back and he's told us not only is your faith not shaken, he's told us how good, how well you're doing. And now we've been encouraged by hearing about the good things. We sent Timothy to encourage you, and yet he's the one that's come back with a word that's encouraged us. I mean, again, the power of encouragement. The power of encouragement. I'll just throw this out. It's all well and good to encourage our kids. I mean, we encourage our kids, right? They do something good, man, we'll heap the praise on them. Maybe, or somebody else's kids. All right? They do something, they do something good and we heap the praise on them. Or something kind of doesn't go their way and we're going to hold them up and build them up and point them in the right direction. But kids are not the only people that need that. Children aren't the only one that need to be encouraged when they do, encouraged when they do well and held up when they don't do well. And we're often not as inclined to be as encouraging to one another as we might be to some young person. And sometimes we don't receive encouragement because we don't give encouragement. Does that make sense? If you have a congregation of people that are always encouraging one another, then when it's your turn to receive it, it'll be there. Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 12 says, "Exhort or encourage one another daily while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin." It's just like the call that John said he got.
That's exactly what I thought of. And every time I remember it, that's the verse that I think.
Yeah.
We're to hold one another up. We're to see each other's needs. That person on your left and right, that's your family.
That's right.
Yeah.
Now, let's move to I want to move over to number 4 at the bottom of page 23. Because I'm going to let Tony... No, I'm here next week, aren't I? All right, I'll start chapter 4 then next week and leave it for Tony the week after. All right, I want to look at this. The church that gets along with one another. Now, the church that loves one another, trusts one another, and encourages one another doesn't have to worry about getting along with one another. By the way, do you know any congregation of the Lord's people or otherwise that have a reputation of not getting along with one another? I'm not going to ask you to name anybody, but I'm sure that if we've been around long enough, we know of some churches in the brotherhood or otherwise that are always embroiled in some type of controversy. Things are never, ever at peace. I've been here 30 years. And I know some of our brethren, I can tell you at least 2 congregations in this area of whom it has been said to me, they have trouble built in the walls. There's trouble built in the walls. In other words, they've never been able to get along with one another. And by the way, both those churches are essentially on the verge of closing, and have been for a long time. I don't know why either one of them's even stayed open as long as they have. But I heard that phrase for the first time. Charles Balcom gave me that phrase back in the late 90s. He was talking about, and he used it with both those congregations. He said trouble built in the walls there. He said, if you're going to, you'll have to tear that building down and build another one in another spot. He said, just the reputation, the building itself contained the reputation. He said, you'll have to tear the building down and build one somewhere else if you're ever going to solve the problem. That is a terrible thing to say about any group, but especially our people. Especially in view of John 13, 34 and 35, by this shall all men know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And so, the church that loves one another, the church that trusts one another, the church that encourages or exhorts one another is not a church that's going to have any trouble getting along. Now, wait. Does that mean that there's never going to be any trouble? No, that doesn't mean that. I mean, Rhonda and I get along pretty well, right? But does that mean there's never? Is it always paradise? Not always. I mean, look at her. Look at her right now. She can shoot daggers through me with them eyes right now. But you understand what I'm saying. But every marriage has difficulties. But that doesn't make it a bad marriage and doesn't even make it a difficult marriage. All churches are going to have problems because churches are made up of human beings. But just like a marriage, when two people that love one another can work through their problems the way God wants them to, and move on, and the same goes for the church. And so the ability to get along with one another, I think, is simply an outgrowth of the first three. Again, if you take care of 1, 2, and 3, you don't have to worry about number. You don't have to worry about number 4. All right. I'm gonna shut this one down right there. We will pick up, Lord willing, on page 27 in chapter 4. By the way, this is the last chapter in this book. So probably in 1, 2, 3 weeks we'll go back to Romans, and I'll have the lessons on Romans 8 prepared, because we finished through Romans 7 almost to the end. There's no sense in going back and trying to rehash Romans 7. Romans 8 picks up a whole new theme, and we'll just start in Romans 8 in 3 weeks from tonight.